I'm Katie Bennett-Stenton, a senior B2B marketer with 20 years experience across the UK, the United States and Asia Pacific. Last year I was fortunate to spend 3 months with Deloitte in Chicago, and during that time I was delighted to have the opportunity to spend time with a number of global experts. Throughout that period, I interviewed a range of leaders and shared their thought-provoking, relevant and influential takeaways weekly. Now that I'm back in Melbourne, the Katie Talks with Influencers continues, although in fact today I'm in Brisbane. And today we are talking storytelling. And in an era when content is often moving more towards moving away from large doorstopper 80-page documents and moving more to content that is small, bite-sized, snackable, easy to consume, I couldn't think of a better person to have this conversation with than my fabulous colleague, Neil Glaser. Neil is the head of Editorial at Deloitte. He is also a well-known industry speaker on all things content, writing and strategy. Neil and I have worked together quite closely over the last 4 years at Deloitte, and to be perfectly honest, in this camp, I consider Neil to be a bit of an oracle. Neil, welcome. Great to talk to you today.
Thank you so much, Katie, for having me on your wonderful local and global podcast.
3 cities mentioned there. Neil, perhaps I'd love it if you could just tell the audience a little bit about yourself before we get underway. But before I do, I am all about acknowledging the diversity of wonderful teams, and the way that the best work happens is, working with diverse teams. And as I was preparing to go to the US to start this podcast series, Neil was absolutely pivotal in helping me to brainstorm the approach that I'd take, the questions and the philosophy that surrounded Katie Talks. So it's terribly fitting that you are a guest.
Thank you, Katie. It's been great to hear all of your insights across all the podcasts. And look, I think it's always interesting people's journeys throughout their career. And I guess a very quick, short, sharp and succinct snapshot of mine would be that I've always loved words. I've always loved storytelling. I've always loved being able to connect issues and themes together. So I headed down the track of doing a combined law degree. So I did a law degree with a communications degree. And that was really fascinating for me because it meant that I explored so many different business-related topics. And then also in the line of communications, that whole element of publishing, journalism, writing, content, strategy and media. So headed down the track of working as a lawyer in the early part of my career, which again was fantastic, all those challenges and working out complex problems and solutions. And I think I started to head in the area of writing in the sense of that I was still working with ideas across so many different areas. So the bulk of my career has been around content, copywriting, publishing, media, communications and storytelling. And I think it's just really interesting that now more than ever, businesses are really hungry for that in terms of being able to cut through what we're bombarded with across the globe, which is so much content and so many messages to consume.
Thanks, Neil. That's really interesting. And I think, if I think about the last 4 or so years that you and I have worked together, the work that we have done and our approach has really evolved, and I think is much more sophisticated that's a fine word, much more sophisticated than it was when we first started. Why is writing so important across the business landscape?
Look, it's really interesting, Katie. I think that I often tell people that there's this writer, Josh Bernoff, who writes various business writing books, and he has a great quote that bad writing costs businesses $400 billion every year. And it's interesting because if we do think about it, that the time spent of people sifting through reams of materials to find out what it means and the overall inefficiency can cost billions, when the time spent could rather be focused on next steps, strategy, or how really to amplify content. So I really think that now more than ever, businesses and different organisations at all levels are looking for content that cuts through, and that's why writing's so important. And the other point that I will mention is that if we take a look at what happens in 2019 in 1 internet minute. So 60 seconds. If you Google out there, you'll come across a range of infographics around this. But the enormous amount of content that's being consumed means that we are living in an age where we really have to focus our attention, as I mentioned earlier, on being short, on being sharp, on being succinct.
That's really interesting, Neil. I was going to ask you why that evolution has happened, but I haven't heard a figure put on that. That's fascinating.
Look, it's really interesting. I think that it's always helpful to quantify things.
Yes.
And I think that I find it's very useful to try and use numbers or case studies or those elements within storytelling to really paint that powerful picture of why something is so important.
So, Neil, what are some of your biggest tips for listeners out there around how to create cut-through content?
So the first thing I will say to people, the biggest tip I'd give them is make every word count. Now, it might sound quite simple, but I think that often people have this compulsion to really create extremely lengthy pieces of content. Now, there is a time and a place for that, but I think making every word count is so critical. And in order to bring that to life for people, I'm always reminded of a great story by Ernest Hemmingway, one of our fabulous writers that we've had. And his friends place a bet on him on who could write the most powerful and engaging story. And this really brings to life the concept of making every word count.
Yeah.
And the challenge was, can you write a really compelling story in 6 words?
6 words?
6 words. You're only allowed 6 words to create a really interesting, cut-through, striking story. And the story goes that they all sat in the bar, and Ernest Hemingway, if you Google the story, you'll find different examples of it.
Yeah.
He was a clear winner, and he wrote a story in 6 words that has become quite iconic, and there's been different permutations of it. And what he wrote down was, "For sale, baby shoes never worn." And in those 6 words, instantly, you're brought into a story and a topic about what happened to the baby. Is it a tale of hope? Is it a tale of despair? There are many possibilities, but in those 6 words, he was able to create a story that really pulls in the reader. Now, there have been a lot of different takes on that 6-word story, and there's also been a lot of different permutations that people have written about, but I often think of it as a great example in terms of why making every word count is so critical, and that one can do it. Sure. And that it's really interesting to be able to craft language, especially when we read and consume so much on our different devices. One way to cut through is make every word count.
That's an excellent point, and it makes me there are 2 things that come up there for me. Your brief reference to reading on devices, and I think that's one very obvious reason why we are focusing much more these days on sort of content that's small, bite-sized, snackable, because people are tending to read it much more on their devices, perhaps while commuting or doing something else, as distinct from sitting at a desktop. But the other element there sort of makes me think about the process that we've gone through over the years when you and I will sit down and sort of first think about a flagship piece of eminence that we're looking to publish, perhaps 9 months down the track. And in our very first meeting with key stakeholders, and we have our overarching strategy, that discussion right up front as to how to approach it. And yes, we have clear distinctions as to what we want our messaging to be, but I'd say almost of equal importance is what sort of structure and style, and we might have one report, but what are the other pieces of content that will come and sort of help to create that rich story. And I think that's been quite an evolution that or a bit of a journey, dare I say it, that we've gone on that front.
Yes, 100%. I think it's always a challenge of making sure that often there's so much that people can say. So really thinking through choosing what is the right message, who is the audience, how can we structure it. That's what's going to create cut-through results.
Sure, and what do we want the outcome to be? Yeah, absolutely. Neil, any other tips you'd like to share?
So I think that another key tip that I love to talk about is really have a point of view. I think that there's nothing worse than reading content or thought leadership that meanders. Okay. So I think it's really important to have a point of view, and I was thinking through what would be the best example around ideas around having a point of view, and I think I'm reminded of a trip that I did recently to New York late last year, and I popped to a wonderful exhibition in Brooklyn, which was all about the artist MC Escher.
Okay.
Now, some people out there on the podcast might know MC Escher or be familiar with his work. He does the most incredible sketches and drawings all about seeing things from a different perspective. So his work is really about having a point of view. And there's a great quote that I saw at the front of the exhibition in Brooklyn when I walked in, was a quote by MC Escher that says, "Only those who attempt the absurd will achieve the impossible." And his entire body of work that was displayed there is all about this. It's all about having a point of view, having a different perspective. And I think that the part that I loved about the exhibition in Brooklyn was that it was a completely immersive experience. So you could not only see his original sketches throughout the exhibition and see them and kind of walk past them, but then there was some of his artwork that was really brought to life in a 3D, 4D dimension. So you could actually become part of the artwork and become part of the perspective and then take some photos around that. So I always think that it's really important with content, with storytelling, with writing, with publishing, with media is, what's your point of view?
Yes.
And what is the argument and the compelling hook that you're really going to entice people with in order to keep on reading? You know, I think that often, as we all are very time poor and there's a lot going on in people's lives, if you can at least hook them in at that start with a really interesting, compelling idea. And so there's one amazing sketch that people might be familiar of, which is a hand drawing a hand, which if you kind of Google that, people can see that it's such a great iconic image of MC Escher's, and it really brings to life perspective and seeing things from a different angle. So I think it shows that, you know, one can create anything with words, but to have a point of view and make content interesting is what it's all about.
Neil, what would you say is the most overlooked element of writing by organisations and businesses?
So I think that one of the biggest things, and we have kind of hinted at it slightly before, is really structure. So I think it's absolutely vital, no matter if you're writing a short email, right through to a social media tweet, or even a long form 100-page report or video script. You know, the start, the middle and the end is absolutely critical. Now, within storytelling, there's a range of elements and structures people can use. So there's another system called Save the Cat, which is often used in film development and narrative, which is around a 15 beats system. So there's 15 points to a story that are really critical around turning points, around milestones, around twists in the plot, etc., etc. But I often favour the 3-act structure, which is really part 1, part 2, part 3, beginning, middle and end, which I think can really apply to everything. So as I mentioned, no matter if it's a short piece of content or a long piece of content, even down to the perfect tweet, really thinking through, you know, what that structure looked like. Are you making the job of the reader easier? And I think that there's a great quote out there that I've read, which is, treat the reader's time as more valuable than your own. So put in the time, put in the effort to make sure that whatever content you're preparing is really engaging around that start, middle and finish.
I think that treat the reader's time as more important than your own is pretty delightful, and I reckon if you are starting out you're planning any piece with that in mind, I reckon that's going to fairly heavily influence where you end up arriving. And
I think it's really helpful that often I say to people, you don't have to get the first draft perfectly polished. I think that sometimes people's frustration with their own writing and storytelling and content comes from this perception that when they write the first draft, it's going to be crystal clear, perfectly polished, and it really isn't. Yes. I think the whole thing is writing is rewriting.
Yeah.
And I think that that's often the part that I enjoy the most, which is the editing, the rewriting, the crafting, the polishing, etc. So I think it's just out there for people to know that things that they might read, they're often seeing the end product of something. Sure. And there might be countless drafts, iterations, workshops, etc. So often when people are thinking about the start, middle and finish, it might bring to, it might highlight for them that actually there's a part in the middle that isn't quite working, or they haven't really got that hook at the start. So it's really helpful just to do a first draft, get it all out on the page, the different ideas, and these techniques apply to all forms of writing, whether it's script writing, whether it's emails, whether it's film writing and development, whether it's animation, video scripts, fiction, non-fiction, creative, business.
Yeah.
I think that structure can help, and often it can really point to what are the areas that you really need to focus on in that second, third, fourth draft.
Sure, I think both in terms of the getting it down on paper or screen, that structure helps. But I smiled when you were saying that for a couple of reasons. One of the things that I find incredibly valuable if I'm writing something myself is to write it, get it all down on paper, and dependent on what sort of content it is and obviously time frames, is to leave it for 2 or 3 days and then come back, and I can be so much more objective. I am somebody who likes to talk, and dare I say it, perhaps even slightly verbose, and I will often have people, yourself included, read something I've written and say, you've got 3 sentences there. I think that can probably be condensed to 1. So a bit of perspective from my side when I'm writing something myself helps. But I also smiled when you talked about the fact that you really enjoy the reviewing, editing and polishing, because that's one thing I've really appreciated working with you and that I find hard. If I've written something really lengthy, the continually going back and polishing and improving sometimes towards the end can feel quite tedious, and I lose the ability to be objective about a piece that I'm really familiar with. I'd love to just hear your thoughts on that, because that strikes me as a real skill that you have also on that front.
Sure. Look, I guess just to also touch on your point, Katie, which I love, around putting something away for a day or two and then coming back to it. I think that that's such a critical element that often, people are quite time poor, but if one can do it, I think it's great to be able to just put that piece away, pick it up 2 or 3 days later, and then you come with it with fresh eyes and just so objective. So, but on your point and your question around that process of editing and rewriting and workshopping, I think that why I love that process is because there is often so much rich content to work with. And I think that often it is always easier to be able to pare back, edit, refine, rather than look at a blank page. And so I think that I love obviously writing things from scratch, but I also love working with stakeholders like yourself and teams and business leaders and organisations to really be able to distill and refine that message. Because I think at the end of the day, often we all have such rich and fantastic and a tapestry of insights to talk about, but at the end of the day, to be able to cut through and be able to distill that message really clearly in a crisp format, almost as if you were in a lift with someone and had a 30-second elevator pitch to be able to say why your topic or why your point of view is so important. That's what I'm looking for across all content that I workshop and edit.
Interesting. That reminds me of that old adage, I didn't have time to write you a short letter, so I wrote you a 4-page one. That really resonates with me. Neil, these days businesses of all sizes are looking to reach a range of audiences, and that's something you and I have talked a lot about over the years. What are your insights and tips around that?
Sure. So I think it's really interesting audience, because I think sometimes as writers, and this applies to anyone who's a writer, because I think that we're all writers, and I think that it doesn't have to be the focus of your day job. I think that every element these days involves storytelling. And so I think audience is really important, and I think that sometimes we all do get very self-focused on kind of what we're writing and what we want to say versus how that's going to resonate with the people that we want to read it. Okay. So I'm always reminded of one of my favourite books by Harper Lee, which is To Kill a Mockingbird.
Yeah.
And there's just a really fantastic quote there by Atticus Finch, one of the lead characters, who says that you never really know a person until you stand in their shoes and walk around in them. And so I think that when it comes to audience, you really have to spend time knowing who your audience is. You know, have you reached out to them? Have you gone out to a focus group? Have you actually met up with the people that you're aiming your content for? And have you asked them what are their pain points around content or reading things? What are they really looking for? So I think that when we're thinking about audience, I think that, you know, a couple of key really important questions to ask is, you know, is my reader in-house or external?
Sure.
Will my reader know anything about the topic in terms of where to kind of structure that language around how technical you should get? Asking yourselves what will get their attention. So are there people who are very time poor? Is it the format of the content that you should be thinking about? You know, should it be an animation? Should it be an explainer video? Should it be a written piece? Should it be a social media message?
Sure.
Should it be an email? Should it be a great headline? So thinking through, what do I want them to do? What is the biggest call to action that you're asking them to do when you're creating your content and piece? And then really, how can I cut through to be able to reach them? And often by spending time with your audience, so, you know, reaching out to people within your network, whether that's C-suite or leaders, right through to different business owners across the small, medium and large enterprises, reaching out to different sectors and different demographics to see what is really going to resonate with them from a content perspective, I think is really vital, and also enables one to gain a lot of really holistic, great, powerful insights that can then really shape your content so that you're really targeting that specific audience and that you know those people are going to be connecting with your content.
You make some really useful points there, Neil. So building on that a little bit, what's the secret sauce for you? What has worked the most for you?
So
tips. Give us another.
So I think that, you know, one other biggest tip that I will give is read your work out loud.
Okay.
Now, I think it's really interesting because people often think, you know, writing might be very solitary, you know, sometimes siloed, you know, sitting there thinking at your desk. And I think that a really critical thing is that we're all human, we're not robots. And in order to connect with people with your content, read your work out loud. It might be to yourself, it might be to a colleague, it might be to someone over the phone, it might be external. I think that it really highlights where there might be errors in your work and whether things are going to resonate, or whether you need to change up the structure or the language. So, for example, you know, people might have written something such as, if you're kind of working through a website and you're hoping that people might log into something, one might have written, you know, you must log in before you may access this information. Now, a better way of saying that is log in to see your reports.
Sure.
So I think that sometimes, you know, rather than this kind of robotic, stodgy, you must log in before you access this information, I think it's just coming back to basics and going, how do we talk as humans? How do we talk as people? And trying to break that down in a way that is really conversational. It can still be business and professional, but is more conversational and far more empathetic and helps us sound like people. So
is that, are we talking here about being a little less formal than perhaps we might have been in the past?
Yes, and look, I think it's interesting because I think that being formal does have its time and place.
Sure.
So I think that, you know, when there are elements that people are drafting content, whether it's, you know, very robust research around thought leadership insights or whether it's a particular paper or a particular topic, but I do think that one can still be business, professional, corporate, robust research and insights and still have an element of being able to connect with consumers by being conversational.
Okay.
So, you know, a few tweaks here or there, and I think it does depend on the format.
Sure.
So if it's, looking through a user experience and an information architecture across a website, that might lend itself more to some really, playful, conversational language that's a lot more human and less robotic, versus perhaps, a more academic type paper and insights around that. But yeah, I think that often people don't read their work out loud. I think people tend to write things and in their own mind it sounds great, but when they actually read it out loud, I think that's when you can really pinpoint some hot spots around this might need a bit more finessing, a little bit more attention.
That's useful. I talk. Sometimes if I'm writing something, I'll talk to myself as I'm working, which can be a little distracting for those around me. But
often it's helpful to talk out loud.
Well, it is.
Even to yourself.
I find that very constructive, but I'm not sure that I do it when I'm reading something back that I've written. So thank you. That's a useful tip.
Because it also helps in terms of pacing the piece.
Sure.
Have you got a really strong headline to hook in someone? Or does it kind of meander about and end up in that by the end of reading the piece, even you're not quite sure as a reader what, I often find that with, when I'm doing writing, like just making sure that am I still interested in the end, in the topic? Have I lost readers along the way? And even at the end, towards the end of reading it out loud, am I leaving people with a call to action or something practical? So really answering that question for the reader of what's in it for them, what's in it for me as a reader, I think is really critical versus what do I feel as a writer? I just want to impart all this information versus, again, is this making a good connection with the reader and, am I going above and beyond to exceed their expectations?
Sure, which we would always or almost always like to do. Neil, let's change tact a little bit here. What advice would you give to your 10-year-old self? So we're not talking too many years ago here.
Very kind of you, Casey. So I think, what advice would I give my 10-year-old self? I think the advice would be to keep on reading, keep on writing, keep on immersing yourself in that world of words, which I have always loved since I was so little and young, in terms of books and writing. And I think I'd also say to myself that there is a wonderful business community of writers, and there's a wonderful world of writing that you can head into, and really expand upon that, and that you'll get to work with some incredible people in being able to really bring to life stories, and that there's just so much out there across the world of words.
That's delightful. I like it. What might people not know about you?
Not know about me? Well, I've worked overseas quite a bit. So I guess I can mention that I worked in London for over 3 years, which was, again, a really fascinating time, during the kind of heart of the financial crisis. So the year before, during and after, which is a really
saw some interesting
fascinating, time
Yeah.
to kind of be, in that kind of heartbeat and centre of the world in terms of time zones and everything.
Yeah.
And then before that, I've also worked in New York, so, which is very dear to my heart. So, have worked there as well. And then obviously I adore Sydney, and so I'm very fortunate to work there. So,
and sunny Brisbane, where we sit today.
And sunny Brisbane, which we're looking outside, and it is a glorious day here.
Glorious
so
and sunny.
It has been wonderful.
Compared to not even double digits and rain in Melbourne. Yeah, absolutely. Shout out to Brisbane. We love Brisbane.
We do.
Neil, would you say that you learn more from success or failure?
Definitely failure. I think that failure is so important. And I think that we live in a world where obviously success is great, and I think not enough people talk about failure. And I think that failure to me is really critical, because I think it means that you're trying. I think it means that you're pushing yourself. I think you're trying different ideas. And I think especially why I love failure is because I think that in writing, often sometimes it is trying a few things over and over again.
Okay.
So a first draft might not work and a second draft might not work. But I think that what I love about failure is that it's often heading hopefully in the right direction, hopefully.
Yeah.
But I think that, you know, I've learned a lot. I think that I, throughout my writing career, have learned a lot from trying different techniques with writing, different structures. And so while it might not have worked on particular occasions, I've learned a lot from that.
Okay.
And I think just being able to try again, try a different tactic, think of a different perspective, think of a different point of view. And I think that what I love about words is that words can take you anywhere. So you can often go from, you know, something not working to creating something from nothing and really bringing to life a different world or a different topic or a different perspective.
It's interesting that think of a different perspective. It seems to be a theme that has come up a few times in our conversation, dealing with a few different questions.
Very true. I think that perspective is so important. And I think that especially because I love storytelling and both fiction and non-fiction, I think that that's what I love about writing. I think that whatever writing you're doing, whether it's business or creative, you are really immersing yourself in a different perspective. You're either seeing the world from someone else's point of view, from a character's point of view, from a thought leader's point of view. And so I think that's a really interesting theme around perspective.
Absolutely. Neil, in the interest of storytelling, I have a fun, slightly lighter question with which to finish our conversation. If you, and I'm sure you'll paint us a glorious, colourful perspective here. If you could invite 3 guests for dinner and they don't need to be living, who would they be?
Gosh, well, I'm thinking as well of how the table would be decorated.
Oh, I love that's where you come
I'm thinking I'd want to make sure I impress these 3 iconic people. So I imagine that, you know, we'd have, you know, a beautiful royal blue velvet table with, you know, 3 very distinct chairs, maybe one that kind of corresponds to each of them.
Well, you could be at the table as well, so that would be
okay,
4
so
chairs.
four chairs. And if I had to think of people I invite, gosh, there's a huge list. I don't want to invite so many people, but if I had to choose 3, I'd probably choose 3 people from slightly different areas and topics.
Okay.
So the first person I would have to have there would be Judy Garland. And I think that I would just have to have her there because I'd have so many questions for her. And, you know, her songwriting and her life and The Wizard of Oz and just that moment in time, I think, in history when it was just such an interesting, you know, time to be alive and just her whole life, I think I'm just so fascinated by. So I definitely have her. Then, you know, and if she wanted to bring Liza Minnelli along, then great.
You'd be okay with that.
That would be perfect. We can pull up an extra chair. I think that in terms of a second person, I'd have to probably go to the world of writing and probably re-look back into what I said earlier around one of my favourite books, which is To Kill a Mockingbird. So I'd have to have Harper Lee. Harper Lee's coming to dinner. You know, she sold over 30 million copies of that book, and really it was the only book she wrote for most of her life.
If we'd had this conversation 2 years ago, we would have been saying only book.
The only book, which I think is fascinating in and of itself. You know, an incredibly successful writer. And, you know, just such a moving story. And so I just love to chat with her about, you know, how that entire book came about and what was her writing process, what were her struggles, etc. And then the third person I'd probably invite would be Oscar Wilde. So again, you know, such an interesting playwright, and I just think it would be, I just would love that dynamic in the room. You've got Judy, you've got Harper, and you've got Oscar, and I just think, you know, I'd pour them each a glass of wine or whiskey or the drink of their choice, and I think that we could have a whole podcast with, you know,
absolutely,
with all of them. So
fabulous, Neil, and I just adore the fact that
storyteller to your core. You started with the way that the table was set out. You didn't jump right into the people.
We haven't mentioned the food that we'd have to prepare.
Oh, well.
We'd have a lovely degustation.
Oh, fabulous.
I think, yes.
But of course you've thought about that too. Neil, this has been a delightful conversation. Thank you very much. It's also been a really interesting, insightful one. I've taken some good notes and I have every confidence that our listeners will do likewise. I really appreciate your time today and all of your support over the last 4 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me, Katie. Appreciate it.
And thanks for listening to the Katie Talks podcast with me, Katie Bennett-Stenton. If you enjoyed this episode, please review me on iTunes to help others find this great content. I have some excellent thought leaders coming up in the series. Subscribe so that you don't miss a single episode. And I love feedback from listeners. You can find me at KTB Marketing on Twitter or Katie Bennett-Stenton on LinkedIn.